The snow fell heavy over Moscow that March, blanketing the communal apartment blocks in a silence that felt both peaceful and oppressive. In a cramped two-room flat on the fourth floor of a crumbling Stalinist-era building on Arbat Street, Ivan Petrov sat at a small wooden table, his calloused hands wrapped around a glass of cold tea. He was 52 years old, a widower, a lathe operator at the Red October machine plant. His wife, Katya, had died 3 years earlier from tuberculosis, a disease that thrived in the overcrowded, underheated communal apartments where 7 families shared a single kitchen and bathroom. His daughter, Anya, would turn 19 in 2 days. She was all he had left. Ivan looked at the object wrapped in brown paper on the table. A typewriter, a Remington Portable, pre-war, American-made, smuggled through layers of black market dealers and factory connections. It had cost him 4 months' salary, saved kopeck by kopeck, hidden in a jar beneath loose floorboards. In Stalin's Soviet Union, such a machine was more than a tool. It was a declaration. Every typewriter in the country was registered with the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Every owner was documented, every keystroke theoretically accountable. But Ivan didn't think about that. He thought about Katya, who had loved poetry. He thought about Anya, who had inherited her mother's passion for words, who filled notebooks with verses she whispered to herself in the corner of their shared room. In a world where speaking freely could destroy you, writing seemed like a safer dream. "She deserves something beautiful," Ivan whispered to himself, touching the package. Just once. The communal apartment was a microcosm of Soviet society. 23 people living in what had once been a merchant's townhouse, now subdivided into suffocating cells. The Petrovs shared their 2 rooms with no one, a rare privilege Ivan had secured through 15 years of unquestioning labor and party loyalty. But the walls were thin. Every conversation bled through plaster and wood. Every cough, every argument, every prayer was public. Next door lived the Sokolovs. Dmitry, a low-level bureaucrat in the municipal housing department, his wife Vera, and their 12-year-old son Alexei. Dmitry Sokolov was a man of anxious ambition, a party member who attended every meeting, denounced every deviation, and watched his neighbors with the intensity of someone convinced that vigilance would protect him from the terror that had already consumed millions. Vera Sokolova was quieter, a schoolteacher who had learned to swallow her words. But Alexei had been raised to believe that loyalty to the state was the highest virtue, that enemies of the people hid everywhere, even behind the smiles of neighbors. Ivan knew the Sokolovs listened. Everyone listened. That was the architecture of fear. Walls that concealed nothing, silence that revealed everything. On the morning of March 5th, 1953, Anya woke to find the typewriter on the table beside her bed. Her breath caught. She touched the keys reverently, as if they were made of glass. "Papa," she whispered, tears in her eyes. "How did you—" "Happy birthday, my sunlight," Ivan said, using the nickname Katya had given her. "Your mother would have wanted you to have this. Write, Anya. Write the things we cannot say." She embraced him, and for a moment in that cold March morning they felt something dangerously close to hope. That same day, Joseph Stalin suffered a massive stroke in his dacha outside Moscow. He would die 4 days later. The Soviet Union held its breath, but in the Petrov apartment, Anya Petrova began to type. She wrote about her mother. She wrote about the birch trees outside Moscow, about the Moskva River freezing in winter, about the small freedoms she imagined, a world where fear did not live in every word. She wrote about faith too, the Orthodox Christianity her grandmother had whispered to her in childhood, forbidden now, but alive in memory. The keys clacked softly. Through the wall, Dmitry Sokolov stopped reading his Pravda newspaper and listened. Stalin's death threw the Soviet Union into chaos. In the Kremlin, Lavrentiy Beria, Georgy Malenkov, and Nikita Khrushchev circled each other like wolves, each calculating how to seize power. On the streets, people wept, some genuinely, some performatively, all terrified of being seen not weeping. The cult of personality that had defined a generation cracked, but the machinery of repression remained fully operational. In the communal apartment on Arbat Street, life continued its grim routine. Anya typed every evening after her shift at the textile factory. She was careful. She wrote in her room, door closed, late at night when she thought others were asleep. But the typewriter's rhythm was unmistakable. Click, clack, click, clack. A sound that suggested thought, composition, perhaps even dissent. Dmitry Sokolov heard it every night. At first he tried to ignore it, but in a society where survival often meant preemptive accusation, ignorance was dangerous. If someone else reported the Petrovs first, and it was discovered that Dmitry had heard but said nothing, he could be implicated as a co-conspirator. Vera urged caution. "They've done nothing to us," she said quietly one night. "Ivan is a good man. The girl is harmless." "Harmless!" Dmitry hissed, pacing their small room. "Do you know what that machine means? Every typewriter is supposed to be registered. If she's writing unregistered materials, it's a crime. And if it's anti-Soviet materials, Vera, they'll send her to the Gulag. And if we knew and said nothing, they'll send us too." Vera fell silent. She taught Soviet children to recite Lenin's slogans, to parrot the party line. But in her heart, she still remembered a time when schools taught Pushkin and Tolstoy without ideological filters. She remembered friends who had vanished in 1937 during the Great Purge, swallowed by the NKVD and never seen again. "What will you do?" she asked finally. "What I must," Dmitry said. On May 12, 1953, Dmitry Sokolov walked into the local KGB office, formerly NKVD, recently reorganized under Beria's brief reign, and filed a report. He described the typewriter, the late-night typing, and his concern that anti-Soviet materials were being produced in the communal apartment. He emphasized his loyalty, his vigilance, his commitment to the socialist motherland. The officer who took his statement was Lieutenant Grigory Orlov, a 34-year-old veteran of the secret police. Orlov had joined the NKVD in 1939, survived the purges by keeping his head down and following orders. He had interrogated hundreds of people, intellectuals, priests, former kulaks, party members accused of Trotskyism. Most were innocent. Most confessed anyway. Orlov read Sokolov's report without expression. "You've done your duty, Comrade Sokolov," he said. "We will investigate." 3 days later, Orlov and 2 junior officers arrived at the communal apartment. They knocked on the Petrovs' door at 6 a.m., the traditional hour of arrest, when resistance was minimal and neighbors were awake enough to witness and remember. Ivan opened the door in his undershirt, eyes bleary. "Yes?" "Ivan Stepanovich Petrov?" Orlov asked, though he already knew. "Yes. We have information that unregistered written materials are being produced in this residence. We are authorized to search the premises." Anya appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, her face pale. The typewriter sat on the small desk by the window, a stack of typed pages beside it. Orlov walked past Ivan without asking permission. He picked up the pages and read silently. Anya's poems were not overtly political, no calls for revolution, no denunciations of the party, but they spoke of God, of personal freedom, of a longing for something beyond the collective. In the paranoid calculus of Soviet power, that was enough. "Anya Ivanovna Petrova," Orlov said, turning to her, "you are under arrest for anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda under Article 58-10 of the Criminal Code." Ivan stepped forward. "No, please. She's just a girl. She writes poetry. There's nothing—" One of the junior officers pushed Ivan back. "Do not interfere, or you will be arrested as well." Anya looked at her father, her eyes filled with terror and apology. "Papa, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." They took her in handcuffs. Neighbors watched from doorways. Dmitry Sokolov stood in the hallway, unable to meet Ivan's eyes. Anya Petrova spent 23 days in Lubyanka, the infamous KGB headquarters and prison in central Moscow. Her cell was 3 meters by 2, shared with 2 other women, a doctor accused of bourgeois cosmopolitanism for corresponding with Western colleagues, and a factory worker who had told a joke about Stalin at a cafeteria. The joke-teller had been sentenced to 10 years. The doctor was still awaiting trial. Anya was interrogated 4 times. Lieutenant Orlov conducted the sessions himself. He was not cruel. He did not beat her, did not deprive her of sleep beyond the natural insomnia of terror. He simply asked questions, read her poems aloud, and waited for her to incriminate herself. "These poems mention God," Orlov said during the second interrogation. "The Soviet state is atheist. Religious propaganda is forbidden." "I'm not preaching," Anya said, her voice shaking. "I'm just remembering. My grandmother taught me prayers when I was little. I didn't think writing them down was a crime." "Everything written is potentially a crime," Orlov replied, not unkindly. "You must understand, Anya Ivanovna, that in our society the personal is political. There is no private thought that does not affect the collective. Your poems speak of individual longing, of spiritual escape. This undermines socialist consciousness." "I didn't mean to undermine anything." "Intent is irrelevant. Effect is what matters." Orlov submitted his report on June 10th. He recommended a sentence of 5 years in a corrective labor camp, citing Anya's youth and lack of prior offenses as mitigating factors. In the chaos following Beria's arrest on June 26, 1953, Khrushchev and Malenkov had moved against him in a desperate power play. Many cases were expedited to clear the dockets. Anya's trial took place on July 2, 1953. It lasted 37 minutes. There was no jury, no defense attorney. A military tribunal of 3 judges reviewed Orlov's report, examined the typed poems, and conferred briefly. "Anya Ivanovna Petrova," the presiding judge intoned, "you are found guilty of anti-Soviet agitation under Article 58-10. You are sentenced to 8 years of corrective labor in a special regime camp. Do you understand the sentence?" Anya nodded, unable to speak. "The state shows mercy because of your youth. Use this time to reform your thinking and embrace socialist principles." Court is adjourned. Ivan was not allowed to attend. He learned of the sentence 3 days later when a notice was delivered to the communal apartment. 8 years. His daughter would be 37 when she was released, if she survived. He sat at the table where the typewriter had been, now confiscated as evidence. He did not cry. He had no tears left. He simply stared at the empty space and wondered if love itself was a crime in this new world they had built. Dmitry Sokolov avoided him. Vera brought Ivan a bowl of soup one evening, left it outside his door, and hurried away without knocking. On July 15th, Anya was loaded onto a Stolypin car, a prisoner transport train, with 40 other women. They traveled east for 11 days, through the Urals, into Siberia, past Novosibirsk, toward the Kolyma region, one of the coldest and deadliest areas of the Gulag system. The camp was called Elgin, a women's labor camp near the town of Magadan. It held over 5,000 prisoners, most convicted under Article 58, political crimes. They mined gold, felled timber, built roads in permafrost. The mortality rate in winter was 12%. Anya arrived in late July, when the brief Siberian summer made survival almost possible. She was assigned to a logging brigade. Her first day, she lifted an axe and wept. The train journey from Moscow to Magadan took 11 days and nights. Anya Petrova spent those days pressed against 40 other women in a Stolypin car, a converted prisoner transport wagon with barred windows barely wider than a hand. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, fear, and human waste from the single bucket that served as their toilet. They received bread once daily, water twice if they were fortunate. Some women wept ceaselessly until their voices broke. Others sat in catatonic silence, their minds already rehearsing the psychological death that might help them endure what awaited at the journey's end. Anya claimed a spot near the window, watching the landscape transform from the flat agricultural plains of European Russia to the dense primordial forests of the Urals, then to the seemingly infinite expanse of Siberia. The familiar birch trees surrendered to towering larch and Siberian pine. Towns became sparse, then disappeared entirely for hundreds of kilometers. The sky expanded until it seemed to swallow the earth. By the time they crossed into the Kolyma region, the coldest inhabited place on the planet, Anya understood with crystalline clarity that she was being erased from the world of the living. This was not mere exile from Moscow. This was banishment from humanity itself. The Gulag was not a single prison. It was a vast, sprawling archipelago of forced labor camps scattered across 11 time zones, from the Arctic Circle to the deserts of Kazakhstan, from the forests of Karelia to the volcanic wastes of Kamchatka. Kolyma was among the most feared destinations. Gold mining and timber operations in an environment where winter temperatures routinely plummeted to minus 50 degrees Celsius, where the ground remained frozen year-round, where survival itself became the primary form of labor. The camps here had been constructed during the late 1930s at the height of Stalin's Great Terror, and they had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives, perhaps millions, though accurate records were never kept or were deliberately destroyed. Elgin was designated a women's camp, one of several in the sprawling Kolyma network. At any moment it held approximately 5,000 prisoners, though the population constantly fluctuated with new arrivals and frequent deaths that were recorded with bureaucratic indifference in ledgers filed in Moscow. The camp was enclosed by multiple rows of barbed wire, wooden watchtowers positioned every 100 meters, and regular patrols of guards with German shepherds trained to tear apart anyone who approached the perimeter. Escape was theoretically conceivable, but practically suicidal. The nearest civilian settlement was over 200 kilometers away through terrain that would kill an unprepared person within hours during winter, and only marginally less lethally during the brief summer. Anya arrived at Elgin on July 28, 1953. The compressed Siberian summer had reached its brief apex. Wildflowers dotted the tundra in unexpected bursts of purple and yellow. The sun barely dipped below the horizon, and daytime temperatures climbed to a deceptively pleasant 15 degrees Celsius. This meteorological mercy would last perhaps 6 weeks before autumn's brutal arrival. The camp commandant was Colonel Yevgeny Dmitrievich Volkov, a career officer in the MVD, the Ministry of Internal Affairs that had absorbed the camp administration system after Beria's reorganization. Volkov was 53, a decorated veteran of the Great Patriotic War who had been seriously wounded during the defense of Stalingrad in 1942 and subsequently reassigned to Gulag administration in 1946 after his combat injuries left him unfit for frontline service. He was not a sadist by temperament. He took no personal pleasure in cruelty, but neither was he afflicted by compassion. He viewed the prisoners purely as economic units in a production equation. His assignment was to meet quotas established by central planning authorities in Moscow. So many cubic meters of timber, felled and processed, so many kilograms of gold ore extracted from the frozen earth. The methods by which he achieved these quotas, and whether prisoners survived the process, were matters of complete indifference to the bureaucrats who evaluated his performance. During intake processing, Anya was photographed from 3 angles, fingerprinted with ink that stained her hands for days, and issued her camp uniform: a thin cotton dress that would provide virtually no insulation, a quilted jacket inadequate for temperatures below -20, felt boots that typically disintegrated after 4 to 6 weeks of constant use, and a faded cloth headscarf. Her head was shaved with dull clippers that pulled and tore, a measure ostensibly to prevent lice infestations, but one that also served to dehumanize and humiliate. The small Orthodox cross her grandmother had secretly given her as a child, which she had hidden in her dress pocket during her arrest, was discovered and confiscated as religious contraband. She was assigned prisoner number Shex 7734, which would replace her name in all camp documentation. "You are assigned to logging brigade number 12, the intake officer informed her, his voice flat with bureaucratic tedium, never lifting his eyes from the forms he was completing. Daily personal quota is 2 cubic meters of processed timber. Failure to meet quota results in reduced food rations. Consistent failure to meet quota results in reassignment to punishment barracks. Do you understand these conditions?" "Yes," Anya whispered, her voice barely audible. "Speak louder when addressing camp administration." "Yes, comrade officer. Adequate. Next prisoner." The barracks were crude wooden structures with no insulation, no real heating system, and minimal protection against Siberian winter. Each building housed approximately 200 women, sleeping on 3-tiered wooden bunks with thin, straw-filled mattresses that provided almost no cushioning from the hard planks beneath. A single wood-burning stove squatted at the structure's center, but fuel was severely rationed and prisoners competed desperately for positions nearest to it. During winter months, ice formed on the interior walls and ceilings. Women slept fully dressed in every piece of clothing they possessed, sometimes huddling 3 to a bunk for marginal additional warmth, trying not to think about the tuberculosis that spread rapidly in such conditions. Anya was assigned to Barrack 7, bunk position upper tier left 17. The upper tier was simultaneously fortunate and cursed. Heat rose from the inadequate stove, making it perhaps 2 degrees warmer than lower bunks, but climbing to it with frostbitten feet and muscles depleted by starvation became its own form of torment. Her first night in the camp, she lay rigid and wakeful, listening to the nocturnal symphony of suffering. Wet, rattling coughs that signaled advancing tuberculosis. A quiet, weeping, whispered prayers quickly suppressed the scurrying of rats that grew fat on whatever scraps they could find, occasional shouts from guards on night patrol. A woman in a nearby bunk recited Pushkin's poetry from memory, her voice trembling with emotion. Another woman harshly told her to be silent. Someone laughed, a bitter, broken sound. Anya closed her eyes and tried desperately to conjure her father's face, but fear kept fragmenting the memory like a photograph torn into pieces. Work began at 5 a.m. when a harsh metal bell shattered whatever fitful sleep the prisoners had achieved. The women stumbled from their bunks in the pre-dawn darkness, dressed in the dim light of kerosene lamps that filled the barracks with acrid smoke, and assembled outside in ragged lines for roll call, a process that could take an hour as guards counted and recounted, searching for any discrepancies that might indicate an escape attempt. Then they marched approximately 2 kilometers into the dense forest, surrounded by guards carrying rifles and accompanied by dogs trained to attack on command. The logging work obliterated any romantic notions about physical labor or connection with nature. Anya had never held an axe before her arrest. Within the first hour, blisters erupted across her palms and fingers, then burst and bled, making every subsequent swing agony. The trees were massive, ancient specimens, Siberian larch and pine, some exceeding 20 meters in height and a meter in diameter. The women worked in pairs, one wielding the axe for felling, one operating the 2-person saw for processing. Guards circulated constantly, shouting abuse, occasionally administering beatings with wooden clubs to women who moved too slowly or paused to rest. The daily quota was absolutely merciless. 2 cubic meters per person meant felling multiple large trees, removing all branches, cutting the trunk into transportable sections, and hauling them to collection points. During summer months with 20 hours of usable daylight, the quota was barely achievable. During winter, it became systematized torture. Anya's assigned partner was a woman named Galina Stepanovna Kuznetsova, 42 years old, formerly a literature teacher at a prestigious Leningrad secondary school. She had been sentenced to 10 years for bourgeois nationalism because she had taught a class analyzing pre-revolutionary Russian literature without sufficient emphasis on Marxist-Leninist dialectical materialism. Galina had survived in Elgin for 3 years, an achievement that marked her as either extraordinarily resilient or extraordinarily fortunate. She was skeletal, her skin bearing a greyish pallor that suggested severe malnutrition, her teeth mostly absent from scurvy, her hands permanently twisted from untreated frostbite injuries. But she remained alive and marginally functional, which meant she possessed knowledge essential for survival. "Listen carefully," Galina said urgently during their first morning working together, her voice kept deliberately low to avoid attracting guard attention. "Never attempt to actually meet the full quota. You will literally kill yourself trying. Do just enough work to avoid punishment reassignment, but not so much that they increase your individual quota next month. Eat absolutely everything they provide, even if it appears rotten or spoiled. Your body desperately needs every calorie. Drink all the soup, even if it's essentially just hot water with a few cabbage leaves floating in it. Your body requires liquid to function. Every morning, before putting on your boots, wrap your feet thoroughly with any cloth you can find. Frostbite always begins in the extremities, and once it starts, it cannot be reversed. Most important of all, make yourself psychologically invisible. Never stand out in any way. Never complain where guards can hear. Never show weakness that might mark you as disposable, but never show such strength that they assign you more difficult work. Survive 1 day at a time, 1 hour at a time if necessary. Nothing else matters." Anya nodded mutely, already too exhausted for speech. The food was not sustenance. It was starvation, distributed in carefully measured installments. Breakfast consisted of a single ladle of kasha, a watery oatmeal gruel made without salt, sugar, or any flavor whatsoever. Lunch, consumed in the forest during a 15-minute pause, was a piece of black bread, often contaminated with mold or sawdust, added to increase volume, and a small chunk of salted fish that was predominantly bone and skin, with almost no actual meat. Dinner was soup, typically cabbage and water, occasionally with fragments of potato or spoiled meat that had begun decomposing, and another piece of bread. Nutritionists who later studied Gulag rations calculated that the total daily caloric intake averaged approximately 1,200 calories, while the physical labor demanded well over 3,000. The mathematical deficit was inexorably made up by the body consuming itself, first fat reserves, then muscle tissue, eventually beginning to break down organ tissue in a desperate attempt to continue functioning. Scurvy appeared within months for most prisoners. Anya's gums became swollen and began bleeding spontaneously. Her teeth progressively loosened in their sockets. Her skin bruised at the slightest contact, her body unable to synthesize the collagen necessary for tissue repair. Galina taught her to chew pine needles when possible. They contained some vitamin C, but the amount available was never remotely sufficient to prevent the disease's progression. Winter announced its arrival with the first snowfall on October 12, 1953, and it did not release its grip until the following May. Temperatures plummeted catastrophically. The inadequate felt boots disintegrated rapidly. Frostbite became absolutely universal, not a question of whether, but merely of how severe. Anya lost all sensation in 3 toes on her left foot. They turned black with necrosis, but somehow, through luck or her body's desperate resilience, did not progress to gangrene that would have required amputation. She considered this outcome fortunate, but the worst aspect of Siberian winter was not the cold, it was the suffocating darkness. By December, the sun grudgingly rose around 10 a.m. and set by 2 p.m., providing only 4 hours of weak twilight. The women worked in near-total darkness, illuminated only by smoking kerosene lamps that provided barely enough light to avoid immediate injury. The psychological burden of this unending darkness was crushing. Depression spread through the camp like contagion. Women stopped speaking entirely, some stopped eating, choosing accelerated death over prolonged suffering. Some walked deliberately into the forest at night and froze to death within hours, a form of suicide that could not be definitively proven and thus brought no additional punishment to surviving family members. Anya survived by continuing to write poetry in her mind. She composed verses as she swung the axe in mechanical rhythm, as she worked the saw through frozen wood that resisted every stroke, as she hauled impossibly heavy logs through snow that reached her knees and sometimes her waist. The poems were her private rebellion, her evidence to herself that she remained something more than an expendable work unit with a number. She repeated them silently, refining word choices, adjusting rhythms, memorizing them absolutely. They addressed her dead mother, the Moscow she had lost, God and faith, the concept of freedom that seemed increasingly abstract. They were the only possessions the guards could never confiscate, never destroy. One poem, composed during January 1954 while working in temperatures of -48 degrees, went, "The trees fall silent in the snow, their voices stolen by the cold, but roots run deep where none can go, and frozen seeds still dream of gold. I am a tree they think they've felled, but in my heart the spring is held." She never wrote these words on paper. She had no paper, no writing implements, no possibility of documentation, but she never forgot them. In March 1954, exactly 1 year after her arrest, Anya's barracks was struck by a typhus outbreak. The disease spread with terrifying speed through the malnourished, immunocompromised population. 12 women died within 2 weeks. Their bodies were stacked outside the barracks like cordwood until the ground thawed sufficiently for burial in the mass graves that ringed the camp. Anya contracted the disease, suffering through 6 days of delirium, fever dreams, and hallucinations. She survived primarily through Galina's intervention. Her work partner spooned water into her mouth to prevent fatal dehydration and physically prevented her from rolling off the narrow bunk during fever seizures. "Why did you save me?" Anya asked weakly when consciousness finally returned. "Because I need a functioning work partner," Galina answered with brutal practicality. "And because you're young. You might actually survive long enough to be released from this place. Someone should." "Will you survive?" Galina smiled, a ghastly expression given her ruined mouth and missing teeth. "No, but I made my peace with that certainty long ago." Galina Stepanovna Kuznetsova died in November 1955 of pneumonia complicated by advanced tuberculosis. She was 44 years old. Anya held her hand during the final hours, whispering Orthodox prayers that Galina had taught her. Prayers from before the revolution, when God was still openly acknowledged, when churches had not yet been destroyed or converted to warehouses and workshops. The years blurred into an endless repetition of suffering. 1954 became 1955, became 1956. Anya's body adapted to conditions that should have been fatal. The chronic starvation, the brutal cold, the endless physical labor. She became gaunt and skeletal, her eyes sunken into hollows, her skin stretched over bones. She resembled a woman of 50, though she was only 22, but she persisted in living. In February 1956, Nikita Khrushchev delivered his famous secret speech to the 20th Communist Party Congress, systematically denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and acknowledging some of the worst excesses of the purges and the terror. The speech was not immediately made public. It was classified and intended only for party members. But word spread rapidly through the Gulag system via released prisoners, sympathetic guards, and the mysterious underground communication network that connected camps. Prisoners whispered about it during rare moments of privacy, daring to hope that genuine reform might finally arrive, that the camps might be closed, that they might somehow be freed. The hope was intoxicating and desperately dangerous. In Elgin, the changes manifested slowly and subtly. Some prisoners, particularly those convicted of the most absurd fabricated charges, those whose cases had been entirely invented by quota-driven interrogators during the worst years of the terror, received sudden releases in 1956 and 1957. Anya's case was reviewed by a rehabilitation commission in August 1957. A lawyer she never met and whose name she never learned examined her file and concluded that while her writings had been ideologically immature and insufficiently informed by Marxist-Leninist principles, they did not genuinely constitute a significant threat to state security. Her sentence was reduced from 8 years to 6 years. She would be released on July 15, 1959. The news should have flooded her with joy and relief. Instead, she felt only profound numbness. 2 more years, 730 days. It simultaneously felt impossibly, unbearably long and incomprehensibly short. She endured. In summer 1958, she was transferred from the logging brigade to the camp kitchen, a position desperately coveted because it meant working indoors and occasional access to extra food scraps. The transfer was entirely arbitrary, the result of a cook dying from food poisoning and a guard noticing that Anya had somehow not yet died despite 5 years in the camp, which suggested unusual resilience or usefulness. She peeled enormous quantities of potatoes, stirred massive pots of cabbage soup, and stole small pieces of bread when supervision was lax. She shared these stolen scraps with women in her barracks. It was a small act of defiance, a small assertion of residual humanity. On July 15, 1959, Anya Petrova was released from Elgin. She received a train ticket to Moscow, 200 rubles, enough for perhaps 3 weeks of food and rent if carefully managed, and an official certificate stating she had completed her sentence. The certificate bore the elaborate seal of the MVD. It was not an exoneration. It was not an apology. It was not an acknowledgement that any injustice had occurred. It was simply a bureaucratic confirmation that the state had finished extracting labor from her body. She walked through the camp gates, past the watchtowers where guards watched her with indifference, onto the dirt road leading toward Magadan. She did not look back even once. The journey to Moscow required 12 days. She sat by the window, watching the landscape reverse its earlier transformation, the forests, the Urals, the plains, gradually becoming familiar. She tried to feel something, relief, joy, rage, anything, but encountered only emptiness. 6 years in the Gulag had hollowed her out completely. She was a ghost, returning to haunt a world that had continued functioning without her. Moscow had changed during her absence. Khrushchev's thaw was in full effect. The city felt lighter, less suffocatingly oppressive. People spoke more freely in public spaces, though still with caution. New buildings rose in modernist style. New fashions appeared in shop windows. Western music could occasionally be heard. Anya walked through streets she had known intimately as a teenager and felt like a complete foreigner. She returned to the communal apartment on Arbat Street on August 3, 1959. She climbed the worn stairs slowly, her body still weakened, her lungs permanently damaged from years of breathing frozen air saturated with sawdust. She knocked on the familiar door. Ivan opened it. He was 68, long retired, visibly frail. His hair had gone completely white. His hands trembled with age and perhaps early Parkinson's. But when he saw his daughter, his face crumpled completely, and he collapsed into her arms, sobbing with an intensity that shook his entire body. "I'm sorry," he whispered through tears. "I'm so sorry, my sunlight. I should never have given you that typewriter. I should have known better. I should have protected you." Anya held him, feeling his bones through his clothes, understanding that he had aged a lifetime during her absence. "It wasn't your fault, Papa," she said quietly. "You gave me a gift out of love. What they did with it, that was their crime, not yours." But even as she spoke these words, she wondered privately if they were entirely true. Love, in that time and place, had been weaponized against people. A father's hope for his daughter had been transformed into criminal evidence. A birthday gift had become a prison sentence. The Sokolovs were gone. Dmitri had been transferred to Sverdlovsk in 1955, a lateral career move that removed him from the scene of his informing. Vera had died of a heart attack in 1957. The official cause was cardiac failure, but everyone who knew her understood it was guilt and shame that had stopped her heart. Alexei, their son, who had been 12 when he watched Anya's arrest, had joined the KGB in 1958, following the institutional path that had destroyed his neighbors. Anya wondered occasionally if he ever thought about her, if he ever felt any responsibility. She doubted it sincerely. She tried to rebuild something resembling a life. She found employment as a cleaning woman in a municipal administrative building, one of the few positions available to former Gulag prisoners who were systematically barred from higher employment due to their criminal records. She worked quietly and invisibly, scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins, never speaking unless directly addressed. She did not write. Not poetry, not letters, not even shopping lists. She did not discuss the camp with anyone. When people asked where she had been for 6 years, she answered simply, "Away," and they did not press further. Everyone in the Soviet Union understood what away meant. In 1962, she briefly married a construction worker named Pyotr Mikhailovich, a simple, kind man who tried sincerely to understand her silences, her nightmares, the way she flinched violently at loud noises or the sight of uniforms. But understanding was impossible. No one who had not experienced the Gulag could comprehend it. The marriage lasted 14 months before Pyotr moved out, frustrated and bewildered by his inability to reach her. "You're not really here with me," he told her the day he collected his belongings. "You're still in that place, wherever it was, and I can't follow you there." He was absolutely correct. Ivan Stepanovich Petrov died in March 1964 of heart failure. He was 73. Anya buried him in a cemetery on Moscow's outskirts. Standing at his grave, she finally permitted herself to cry, not only for him, but for everything they had lost. For the life that had been stolen from them both, for the gift that had become a curse they could never escape. She lived quietly for 34 more years. She worked, she aged, she survived. She never sought official rehabilitation, though thousands of former Gulag prisoners were exonerated during the Khrushchev and later Gorbachev eras. Anya never pursued it. She did not want to relive the experience by filling out forms, providing testimony, attending hearings. She wanted only to be forgotten, to disappear into normal Soviet life. She died on November 17, 1998, at age 64, of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, a direct legacy of 6 Siberian winters, of breathing frozen air filled with sawdust, of years spent coughing in unheated barracks. She died alone in a small apartment in a Moscow suburb. Her body was discovered 2 days later by a neighbor investigating an unpleasant smell. She left no family, no possessions of value, no written record of her experiences. The poems she had composed mentally in Elgin were gone, deliberately forgotten as a survival mechanism. She had chosen silence, and silence had ultimately consumed her entirely. But history proves less forgiving than individuals about forgetting. In 2003, 5 years after Anya's death, Dr. Irina Mikhailova, a researcher working for Memorial, the Russian human rights organization dedicated to documenting and preserving the memory of Soviet political repression, was systematically examining newly declassified KGB archives when she discovered Anya's file. The file was thin: arrest report, interrogation transcripts, trial summary, sentencing document, camp assignment, release certificate. But attached to it, miraculously preserved through bureaucratic inertia, were 12 handwritten pages. Anya's poems, originally typed on the Remington portable her father had given her, confiscated during her arrest in May 1953, carefully filed as criminal evidence. Dr. Mikhailova read the poems and wept at her desk. They were beautiful and delicate, filled with longing, faith, and wonder. They were also utterly harmless. No calls for revolution or violence, no denunciations of specific leaders, just a young woman's intensely private thoughts about her grief for her mother, her sense of wonder at the natural world, her inherited religious faith, her belief in something transcendent beyond purely material existence. One poem, dated March 7, 1953, 2 days after Stalin's stroke, the same day Anya received the typewriter, read, "My father gave me keys of steel, not to lock doors, but to reveal the words we dare not speak aloud, the prayers we hide beneath the crowd. But keys can also forge a chain, and gifts of love can bring us pain. Still, I will type what must be said, though silence keeps the living dead." Dr. Mikhailova included Anya's poems in a 2004 anthology titled Voices from the Gulag, Women's Poetry of Political Repression. She wrote a biographical essay about Anya, reconstructed from archival documents and interviews with elderly residents of the Arbat Street communal apartment who still retained memories of the Petrov family. In 2007, documentary filmmaker Alexei Smirnov produced a short film about Anya's story, titled simply The Typewriter. The film included dramatic readings of her poems by contemporary Russian actresses, archival footage of Stalin-era Moscow, and scholarly commentary from Gulag historians. It premiered at the Moscow International Film Festival and received an award for Best Short Documentary. Anya's story entered public memory, becoming one small but significant piece in the vast mosaic of Soviet repression. Her father's gift, the typewriter, that symbol of hope and expression, was remembered not as a crime but as a profound tragedy, a reminder of how totalitarian systems weaponize love itself. In the end, the Cold War was fought not only with nuclear arsenals, spy networks and proxy conflicts, but with typewriters and whispers, with denunciations and forced confessions, with love transformed into evidence and hope into sentences. Anya Petrova's story represents one among millions, but it remains singular in its intimacy, in how it reveals the machinery of repression operating at the most personal level, in the space between father and daughter, in the gap between gift and crime. The Gulag system is dismantled now, the camps abandoned or converted into museums. But silence remains. Millions of stories like Anya's were never documented, millions of lives erased without record. The poems they composed, in minds, in hearts, in freezing barracks, are lost forever. But some survive, and in survival they testify. They insist we existed, we mattered, we dreamed of freedom even when dreaming itself was forbidden. That is Anya's legacy. Not the 6 years in Elgin, not the decades of silence afterward, but the poems themselves. Fragile, beautiful, defiant proof that even in the coldest, darkest places, the human spirit refuses complete extinction.